Thank you for coming, Ian.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
I was reading your first trip to China, a fascinating story of being an
hmm
exchange student at Beida in
hmm
the 80s. Could you narrate a little bit of that story? I mean, you've written about it, but just in terms of your own words now, how would you describe that trip?
Uh, yes, I didn't intend to study Chinese at university. I went to the University of Florida for not any particularly good reason, except my girlfriend was going there. And then I thought, oh, I probably would like to be a journalist, and they have a good journalism program. So I convinced my parents, who thought I should apply to other universities. Instead, I went there. And then they had a language requirement. I grew up in Montreal, and we had just moved to Florida when I was in high school. I didn't want to take another European language, so there was an ad that a teacher had put up on a bulletin board, like a real old-fashioned bulletin board, actually saying looking for students to fill out a class in Chinese. And I decided to take the Chinese as a lark for fun. And I guess in the back of my mind, a couple things were happening. My father worked for the Hong Kong company Swire. Um,
太古集团.
yeah, Taigu, right? And they own Cathay Pacific, and they're a big shipping company and real estate company and so on and so forth. And so I thought maybe he'd been to Hong Kong a few times, so maybe that was in the back of my mind. Also, this was the time just after diplomatic relations had been normalized in late 1970s, and the first wave of books were coming out by foreign correspondents like the husband and wife team of Linda and Jay Matthews, who wrote a book called 1 Billion, Fox Butterfield, Alive in the Bitter Sea, Bernstein's From the Center of the Earth, From the Center of the Earth or From the Center of the World is,
Yeah.
anyways, this book about China. They all wrote these books on China after they'd been there for a couple of years. So I thought, yeah, maybe I'll take Chinese for fun. I was always interested in other cultures and stuff like that. And I had a fantastic Chinese teacher. He made Chinese a lot of fun, and he was a very gifted linguist and wrote a great grammar of Chinese. And so it became like this puzzle. And then I knew from my experience growing up in Montreal, and this is at a time of a lot of tension in Quebec, in Canada, over language. It led to a terrorist movement and almost a separation of Quebec from Canada and so on. So I knew the importance of language and in being in the environment, that you really only learn a language efficiently if you're in the environment. So they had an exchange program to Beijing, and I went to Peking University. So I went to Beida and spent 6 months there. And I realized how terrible my Chinese was at that time. And but it was a great experience nonetheless. In hindsight, at the time when you're living in something, especially when you're a younger person, you think that something that happened 5 or 6 years ago or 10 years ago is ancient history. But in fact, most people have experienced that in society. And the Cultural Revolution had only just ended, really. 84, Cultural Revolution just ended 6 years ago. So I experienced that in many different ways. I was asked to teach English at a school, and I went there and I had students write essays, the way you normally do. And one student wrote like a 10 or 15-page essay about her experience as a sent down youth. And I'm not as smart as somebody like Peter Hessler, who probably could have written a whole book around this. I was like, oh my God, like this is amazing. It's also kind of sensitive. So I corrected the grammar in the essay and sent it back to her. And instead I probably should have photocopied it and then, like later written an article. Anyway, I wasn't that clever. And, but I had these kind of experiences. There was some guy who, befriended us, who claimed to have been related to Puyi, the last emperor. Probably nonsense, but he was clearly a little pogo loco, like a little crazy, a little Shen Jinping, probably from the Cultural Revolution and all that.
Mm.
He became a great friend of ours. We I was rooming with a person who went on to become a noted Chinese political scientist of China, Chris Reardon, who is now at the University of New Hampshire. And Chris was a great roommate. I was with mostly older students who were there through the Committee for Scholarly Communication with China, the CSC PRC. And they sort of took me under their wing, and we went travel bicycling all around the place. We bicycled because there was very little in the way of subways in Beijing then, just two lines, and the buses were terrible, and so we biked everywhere, and we used this guidebook called Nagels, Nagel apostrophe S. They publish these books that are called encyclopedias, like travel guidebook encyclopedias, kind of small, compact, but very fat. And so they would have like a whole section at the beginning, Chinese philosophy and Chinese history, and they'd go through and tell you what all the done. It's meant, I think, for somebody to sort of read on the airplane flight over, or more like a ship, trip over, because they were like really thick. And then they would have like major things in each city. Then they had fold-out maps like of the Forbidden City. And this was compiled in 1964, I think primarily by French diplomats. And then it had been reprinted around 1980 when China was opening up again. And it was a great book to have, a great guidebook to have, because it showed the Beijing before the Cultural Revolution. So it said, like, going to Utase, the Goba, five pagoda, like, temples, or Utase, five tower, like, temple. And it still exists. But when we went there, it's like a big platform with five, like, towers on the top, the Gobas, I think, right? And they were all smashed and destroyed. There were tiles everywhere. And it's sort of behind a factory gate entrance. Now, if you go there, the whole thing's been cleaned up as a park. They've rebuilt everything. You wouldn't know anything had happened. But back then, you could still see these signs of the Cultural Revolution. And we only knew these things existed because they're in the guidebook. Because if you're just driving down the street, riding your bike down the street, you wouldn't have noticed it because other stuff had been sort of built in front of it. So that was a great source of information. We also traveled around. We made trips to Datong and Luoyang and Xi'an, and then also I went down to Hangzhou, Suzhou by train. These are the time of really slow trains, with the hard sleeper, and it was a great chance to talk to people and learn more Chinese, so on and so forth. So it was a good experience, and I on that trip I wrote my senior thesis for college. I ended up doing an interdisciplinary degree in journalism and Asian studies, and I wrote about foreign journalists in China. So I still have that thesis, actually. It's not the world's greatest senior thesis, but it's actually okay. I interviewed all the journalists who were there. I did it on North American journalism in China after 49 because American newspapers couldn't be in China, but there was the Toronto Globe and Mail, which had a correspondent there through the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so I talked to, like, the New York Times correspondent at the time was John F. Burns, who had been a correspondent for the Globe and Mail sort of 10 years before that. And I talked to them about all of their experiences, the limitations, the problems they had. And I noticed something that really affected my work later was that journalists tend to copy each other a lot. There's a lot of sort of, I don't think copycat, maybe a little wrong, but, Me Tooism, like, you're doing that, I'll do that too, and always trying to match somebody else. And part of that back then, in the early 80s, was that it was hard to travel around China. It was hard to get interviews. It's kind of like it is now in the 2020s, but later it became much easier to do work in China in the 1990s and the 2000s, which were kind of a golden age. But back then, if you could only go to Beijing and Tianjin without government permission. So you could go to Tianjin without government permission because that was the harbor. So they kind of, foreigners have to go to the harbor to get their stuff from ships. And you were allowed, there's a small strip of land between Beijing and Tianjin, Hebei, right? There's a bit of Hebei there, and you were allowed to go on that highway. But you weren't allowed to just like go off to Zhangjiakou or take a train to Shijiazhuang or something without permission. So journalists had a hard time getting out and talking to people. And so if somebody said, there was, say, a profile in Renmin Ribao of a successful farmer, a 10,000 who, they called them millionaires, but just had earned 10,000. Wang Hu, yeah. So everybody would like go interview that person, and they'll write the same story.
Oh, so they were actually matching the people's daily.
Well, that's how they
and
do
then matching each other.
That's how. Yeah, first they. I mean, that's how they get information. Maybe from China Daily or something. Or maybe somebody heard about it, but then she did that. Well, I'll go do it too. And I had sympathy for them, but I noticed this is actually a phenomenon, not just in China, but it's became a phenomenon again, especially in the internet age, when everybody is on watching each other on Twitter, and your editors are watching you, and then they're saying, "Oh, so and so had a story about this riot in Xinjiang. You have to write it too." And so I criticized that in my senior thesis, and I vowed if I were ever to go back to China as a correspondent, which was my goal, that I would not do that. And so that had, you know, I guess that informed how I viewed what being a correspondent was. I wanted to, well, I had sympathy for the restrictions that they were under. I didn't want to do stuff like that. I wanted, if at all possible, to get out and talk to more people and break out of the news cycle, which is really a prison, because you end up just copying each other. So, yeah, that was my first trip to China in 84, 85. And then after that, I realized, boy, my Chinese is crap. So I then went back to Florida, graduated, got a job to pay off some college debts. I worked at a local newspaper in Orlando, Florida. And then my teacher, the guy I really liked, Dr. Chu, he was Taiwanese. He was like a Weisheng from Taiwan. And his classmate ran this thing at Taiwan Shifan Daxue, the Taiwan National Normal University. They have a thing called the Mandarin Training Center, the Guoyu Zhongxin. So I went to Taiwan in 86 and stayed there for 2 years. And I think that's when I really kind of learned. I feel like much more intensive. It's 2 years.
Yeah. And I think one theme throughout your journalism career was this focus, this attention on the Chinese underground society, the churches, the underground historians, the civil associations, the civil society that the government not only refuses to recognize, but also from time to time repress.
Yeah.
And it seems that even from your very first trip, you were looking for that underground society, but looking at Nagel's guidebook and finding out old temples that have been smashed up that people didn't really know about. But if you did look closely enough, you could discover them. Well, how would you describe your interest in the underground China? One that you came to write a lot more about much later, but you seem to have a consistent interest in.
Yeah, you could say underground or grassroots is maybe the thing I think of the most. I guess I wasn't so interested in intellectuals in Beijing and their disputes and discussions. And in some ways, that was a pity because I was in China from 1994 to 2001 as a correspondent, during my first stint as a correspondent. And I never interviewed Liu Xiaobo, right? And it was like, of course, he was in and out of jail. He was under house arrest a lot, but he would have been somebody. Later, I realized that was a bit churlish of me too. But I kind of felt like the intellectuals in China didn't seem to reach in and didn't really have good explanations for society because they didn't really interact with a lot of society. Like they played the role of the loyal critics of the government, or they were often. You can see this in the scar literature by these people who had experienced the Cultural Revolution, and they kind of would were almost like more upset that they had been victimized. Like they wanted to victimize other people, or they thought, I'm the loyal. I should be talking to the
I should be the one in charge.
Yeah.
Instead, I got suppressed.
Like this sort of 忧国忧民, like, concern for the country, concern for the people, sort of thing, which is often kind of just self-serving bullshit. So I wasn't so interested in them. I thought there was more. I also just thought, China's such a big country. It would be like if you spent all your time inside the Beltway in Washington. If you were a U.S. correspondent and you spent all your time inside the Beltway, you would have a really warped view of the United States, right? If you'd never been to the Mississippi Delta, if you'd never been to Texas, if you'd never been to California, or whatever, But it was similar in China. It's a similar sized country. So I thought my role was to get out of Beijing. And I had a rule when I went back as a correspondent that I would try to spend 1 week every month traveling outside of Beijing, which maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a lot. Because when you try to logistically organize it, it means that you come back, you write your articles for a week, and then you're already planning your next trip. And you've got to, especially in the 1990s, it was harder because the logistics weren't so easy. And then you'd have to plan your trip, you have to get permissions and stuff like that to do it. But I did do that quite a bit. And it got easier and easier to do that because China's infrastructure got better. It wasn't so hard to fly places. Trains, of course, later got really good. And by the late 2000s, early 2010s, it was really easy to work and to go out to the grassroots. And I rented a car, it was like no problem to rent a car. You could fly into Nanjing or someplace like that, and there'd be a Shenzhou car rental place there on your app, and you just ding, 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 go get the car and drive off and, do whatever you want. So it became progressively easier. But yeah, I did I felt it was, well, this is more fun. It's just more fun. And I was lucky because early on in the 1990s, I worked for two publications that were the opposite of the New York Times. The New York Times is the paper of record, and like if Liu Xiaobo is detained or something like that, you've got to write an article about it. If something happens, Premier lets out a fart, you got to write about it. You got to kind of match the wires, and your editors are always like asking you to do that. But I first worked for the Baltimore Sun, which was a local newspaper that had a grand tradition of, I had the first foreign correspondence in America. Now it doesn't have any foreign correspondence, like all regional newspapers in the U.S. But back then it had 8 in different bureaus around the world. And they told me, we don't want what's on the wire. We can get the wire. Don't give us the wires. Go travel. Tell us what it's like in China. And so I was sort of friendly with the guy from the Washington Post. And he often, if the foreign minister said something, the Washington Post had to report it. The New York Times, they were always competing for these kinds of scoops and stuff like that. I didn't have to. I could just go off and do stuff. So that was kind of fun. And then later I worked for the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal, which I joined at the beginning of 1997, they had an explicit policy that we are a second read newspaper. So everybody has their hometown newspaper, like the Houston Chronicle or the Kansas City Star or the New York Times or whatever, and they read the Wall Street Journal when they get into the office. And so that we don't want to have stuff that's in those papers already. So, and they had a very good editing staff back then. They got rid of all of that later after Murdoch bought it, kept cutting the newspaper. But they used to have a staff where you were allowed to encouraged to write these long articles that were well researched and edited by many people. And they always had to be kind of exclusive. Like, in other words, they didn't want it. If it had been in the New York Times, you could have worked on something for a month. And if the New York Times did a kind of chapeau half-assed version of the story, they would say, sorry, it's killed. And it was like sometimes crushing, when that happened. But that was a great experience because it really encouraged us to do something different. And also, looking at China through the economic lens meant that it was also in some ways less, like, we were not viewed as sensitive by the government. They kind of had this equivalency. They thought the New York Times was like People's Daily, and they said the Washington Post is like Guangming Ribao, and you are like Jingji Ribao. It's like, okay, who reads Jingji Ribao? Anyways, but it's like the economic newspaper.
It's less ideological.
We're just writing about the economy, which back then was like a good thing. It's opening up. China wants to be part of the world economy. And so we were welcome. And that meant that when I was writing later on Falun Gong for the Wall Street Journal, they didn't pay any attention. I remember at the height of the Falun Gong protests in downtown Beijing, because, it went on for like a whole year. People protest. I was going for a walk with Charles Hutzler, who at the time was the AP bureau chief. And he was with his kids. And there were these plainclothes policemen behind us. I'm like, oh, I wonder who they're following. So Charles said, let's go check. So he went this way with his kids, and I went that way. And they followed him. I thought, how is he's got his kids with him. What can he be doing that's interesting? And in fact, I was going to go meet somebody from Falun Gong. He was just taking his kids to the playground, but they were just so fixated that AP is like Xinhua, in their equivalency mind. So, we were paid as close attention. So,
well, where did they get that idea from? That sort of equivalence that New York Times is People's Daily.
This is what Chinese journalists would tell me. They'd always joke about that. And I don't know if it's exactly true, but they did view it as a less sensitive paper. And, probably overall, we weren't always writing about human rights. Like the New York Times basically was always writing about human rights. And it was one of the problems, I think, with the foreign reporting is that even when things were pretty good in China, journalists, I wrote an article about this for the New York Review of Books, but journalists are trained to only find the bad, right? They always say, like, the bridge that collapses is the news. The bridge that doesn't collapse is not news. And that's, I understand, like, especially for a local newspaper, if a bridge collapses, it's news, right? For sure. But in a developing country like China, which is building bridges all the time, and infrastructure is like a big thing, actually the bridges that they're building is kind of a big story. And I remember having that conversation with a member of the foreign ministry in 94. After getting there, I went on a trip. They used to organize these trips, MOFA did. And we went to Guizhou to look at the poverty alleviation. And this guy asked me that question. He says, why do you look at all these bridges that we've built here? Why did you write about this? I'm like, ha, so silly and naive you are. That's not a story. That's the bridge. So what? I said, that's when it collapses. It's, it's not dog. What is it? Dog bites man. That's not news. Man bites dog. That's news, right? So it has to be something unusual. But later I realized I kind of got it wrong, because in effect, he had a point. Like these bridges, all that infrastructure, it was what helped lift many people out of poverty, or the infrastructure that they were building. These roads, it was and stuff like that. Had a huge impact economically, but we didn't really write about that. So I thought sometimes it was working as a journalist. Yeah, working as a journalist was good. It's a mixed bag. I think working in a foreign country can be misleading to readers, because if you're working for the Palo Alto Daily and you write about a bridge collapse, the readers know most bridges in Palo Alto have not collapsed, and this is an unusual situation. But if you're writing about China and it's a series of catastrophes, this guy got arrested, that thing happened, there was an earthquake, blah, blah, blah. People back in the United States think, wow, China's really fucked up, right? Like, look at all that shit happening. It's like, I just arrested him there. And then you don't realize that actually, millions of people are lifting themselves out of poverty, hundreds of millions of people, the country's roaring ahead economically. People would come to visit sometimes in China, friends and relatives, and they say, wow, it doesn't look like I think it like. They thought it would look like Soviet Union, or in the middle of the Cold War, or North Korea or something like that. And it was kind of pretty relaxed. I mean, it wasn't that, of course there were human violations, lots of them, like Falun Gong. But it was often, as a foreign correspondent, it was a weird feeling that, you really need to be more of a sociologist to write about a country, or an anthropologist, rather than being this hard-nosed, driven journalist. But, what did I get a Pulitzer for? I didn't get a Pulitzer for writing about bridges being built. I got a Pulitzer for writing about people being beaten to death, for Falun Gong people being beaten to death by police. So, that's what you get the rewards for.
I guess the normal expectation of journalism everywhere is to write about bad news, is to write about wrongs that have been committed, so you would correct, for the sake of justice. And
that's what they always say in the Pulitzer. Like, part of the Pulitzer submission, or any prize submission, is what was the impact of your article. So they want you to say, I did a series about bridges in Palo Alto after this one bridge collapsed. I saw that 25 bridges were in bad shape, and the state government passed a new extra budget based on these articles to rebuild the bridges in Palo Alto. Oh, great. That's what we want. Right? That's what all these foundations and stuff want. But the reality is that when you're writing about a foreign country, you're also kind of interpreting. You're supposed to be giving a picture of what's going on in the whole country. You're supposed to be giving a picture of what's happening in the country, I think. I still wrote most negative stories. I think, like, on some level, that is a contradiction, a problem.
There are two directions I want to go from here. One is how did you decide what stories you wanted to pick up? Since you didn't want the mainstream stuff, you didn't want whatever your colleagues were writing about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the new statement, the U.S.-China relations. You wanted to find out about the real China, the one that's hidden, that's waiting there to be found as a piece of gem. But at the same time, there's plenty of praise around for China. If you just look at People's Daily, Guangming Ribao, the official propaganda machine, and of course, all that happened, all the reporting that happened before the the rise of the private media in China, um, news was pretty biased in the direction of being favorable to the Chinese Communist Party in China. So the fact that there were foreigners coming in criticizing, finding out which bridges actually did burn and which buildings did collapse and which officials did um, corrupt and killed a bunch of people. That's actually good service for the Chinese media um, consumers. Perhaps less so for the foreigners. So I wonder. I mean, you can take turns to answer these questions. How did you pick your stories, and what do you think of your reporting to the Chinese consumers?
Well, a weird thing about being a foreign correspondent in a place like China is your work has basically zero impact on China, except maybe in some in some way, or abstract way, but it's never read by the people. When my first job, like I mentioned, that paper in Orlando, I was in a community that had, it wasn't a city, it was a community in the county. It was like a giant subdivision, and I was like the only reporter on it. And they had a meeting once a month with the county officials, and they decided stuff like what roads are. People took that really seriously. They had an advisory council, and I was like the only guy that reported on it. When the article would come out the next day or the day after, people would call me up. Had a lot of retirees there. These are like ex-World War II military guys, and then they treated me like their kid. They said, "Listen, you got this a little bit wrong. This article, you got that number is not exactly like that. The tax rate is not 2.3, it's 2.2, and but that's pretty good, and you'll get it right the next time." You got like immediate feedback. You couldn't write any bullshit. And people can go to any foreign country and kind of like make up shit. Oh, I talked to old Wang and he told me he hates Xi Jinping. Like, who's old Wang, right? Like, it's like you don't even know Wang Jun. And just call somebody Wang Jun. There's like 10 million Wang Juns in China. And so I think it doesn't encourage good journalism. There's a lot of stuff. I saw a colleague at the New York Times who just made up, he wrote stories based on cut lines that photographers. So photographer would go out and take all these pictures and write the cut lines, and then he wrote the article as if he had seen this himself, but he was just rewriting the cut lines into an article. And finally, the Times had to take some measures against that person. But there's like nobody to check on you in a way. There's no feedback mechanism. I mean, the foreign minister will get angry, but it's almost like a badge of honor to get yelled at by the foreign minister. I must be doing a good job if they're yelling. So I don't think it has much impact. I mean, it might, writing on the police beatings with the Falun Gong practitioners, it might have had some impact on how the police acted later. It's important to write about human rights abuse, like that wrong, but I don't think it has a big impact on China. How do I choose articles to write? I always think that working especially in a place like China, there's some correspondents would have a really hard time coming to China because they would be used to being able to wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to write an article on bridges collapsing in my city, and go and start reporting them. And maybe in the afternoon, they can write the article. That they talk to a bunch of experts and go interview the mayor and stuff like that. Maybe take 2 days, but at the end of the day, they could, or at the end of the week, they could finish their article and write it, and it'd be over, just like that, right? But in China, and in a lot of foreign corresponding, really, it's like this, but I think in China, it's especially true. It's more like making food, like making stew or soup on the burner. And you have to opportunistically find stuff. Like you might need an onion, but you don't have it. You can't go to the supermarket and buy the onion. You have to you're going out, I found an onion. I'll go home, cut it up and throw it into the pot. And then I can add something else and add something else. And then when it's ready, I serve it. It sounds like a terrible way to cook, actually. But I think a lot of articles are like this. So in China, I'd have these big themes. Like I want to write about being overtaxed. Like that was a big theme that I wrote about when I was with the Wall Street Journal. And I knew there was this issue. I would talk to academics about it. I would read scholarly papers on it. I would talk to Chinese experts on it. And then the hardest thing was always finding the case study that would show that. So
like an interviewee, someone who's willing to talk.
Someone who's willing to talk and being able to go to that place and stuff like that. And then you find out, okay, well, it's really a problem in this one place in Shanxi, and there was this lawyer, and maybe you can go talk to them. And then you go out there and make your trip to try to get the the color, if you will, but also the anecdote, the case study that you need to make it work. So it's a kind of a different way because in an open society, you can much more easily then talk to these people, and you can set out and say, I'm going to go find these bridges or whatever it is. I'm going to find these farmers. I can go to talk to them. There's a farmers association that will talk to me. If you're an American, you want to, it'd be super easy.
Yeah.
And you could go to the town and talk to people, and they would probably talk to you, and then you could talk to the mayor, or it would be so much easier. In China, getting to that place, not getting busted by the local public security bureau, figuring it out logistically, that was always the hardest part. So I'd have a whole bunch of topics I was interested in and working on. I'd have file folders where I would collect information. And then I would sort of have priority lists of things, maybe 10, 20 topics that I was working on. Some of them I never did, but others then, come together.
Were there things that you wish you had reported on, but you never got around to?
I always think back to Liu Xiaobo, how I just read Perry Link's
biography
of Liu Xiaobo. I just wrote a review of it for the New York Review of Books. It hasn't appeared yet. Probably it'll appear by the time this interview is finished. It never was made public in 10 years. But anyways, I thought it was a really great book, and I regret that I didn't have a chance to meet him and talk to him, especially later, the 2000s. But anyway,
did you have the chance to?
I probably could have if I'd made an effort. But I got there, I got there in 94, and I also just wasn't interested. Before me, I was this post-Tiananmen correspondent generation. There were people before me who had seen Tiananmen, like the Nick Kristoff and people like that. They had reported on Tiananmen. I hadn't. I was kind of not really interested in continually writing about, it's the 4th anniversary of Tiananmen, some people got detained. It's the 5th anniversary, it's the 6th anniversary, somebody got detained, and all this kind of stuff. It just seemed to me like this was this never-ending cycle. And it was also, frankly, I think it's also the easiest kind of journalism to do, or used to be, because Human Rights Watch or Human Rights in China would send you back then a fax with some information on somebody who was detained. You could go interview them. It would be one of these few articles that you could do in one day, and you could then call back to somebody in the United States to get some quotes, or call somebody in Hong Kong in the same time zone, get some quotes, and write up the article, and you'd have a feeling of success, a chengjiu gap. I've written the article, and of course you get a lot of applause for doing that, for writing about those things. And, it's good to get that on the record, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of the easiest stuff to, because those people want to talk. Usually the distant do want it. So as long as you can get them on the phone or go visit them if they're not under house arrest, they'll happily meet you. It's the opposite of government stuff. Government officials never want to talk. So that's actually would be the hardest part. If you're thinking of this puzzle that you're trying to do, or this stew that you're trying to do, it would be to get the government's point of view, ironically. I mean, you could recreate it by looking at what has been said in the official media, or you could talk to a think tank that's affiliated with the ministry in question and get basically an idea of government policy. But to actually be able to sit down with a government official and ask them about rural taxation or something like that, it's almost impossible.
No, I get the sense, nor did you really want to talk to the government. Your work is less on the Chinese government, and so we're getting exclusive access to this person and that person, and seems to be more focused on the Chinese society.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're doing something on, say, rural taxation, like why farmers, this is a big issue in the 1990s, that farmers were being overtaxed, or being taxed like crazy for all these different things. There were riots and protests and stuff. You want to somehow get the government view of it. Kind of need that as to be fair.
They just didn't want to talk.
They never wanted to talk. I mean, I remember once in 2010, I did a series of articles for the New York Times on urbanization. And they had this policy in southern Shanxi province to bring people off these mountains, where actually historically people had not really lived. They'd only lived there when the population boomed in the 19th century. And it was very sheer and not very good. It was all terraced. and there were mudslides that had killed hundreds of people one year. And so the government said, okay, right, we're getting all those people off there. So I applied. I heard there was some office in charge of the relocation, and the guy gave me an interview in Xi'an, and it was amazing. You went into the room, and it was like a war room. You had maps of the area on the wall with like lights and stuff like that. You felt like you were in the NORAD command post, and this guy was like, he had all the facts at his fingertips, where they were going to do, what kind of jobs they'd have for them. Because the big issue with this is what do farmers do when they can't farm their little fields on the side of the mountain, and how much is being invested and what roads are being built, and he had all these like, enormous walls map. It was this incredible command post they'd set up, And in some ways, it was great PR for the Chinese government because, in some ways, the official in China, the civil servants are quite competent compared to many other countries. Like they have even like some, party hack, Shizhang or Shengzhang. He knows all this shit, right? You can ask him about what's the agricultural plan. They're talking like endlessly about facts and figures and stuff like that, and they know their brief, like in a way that most U.S. officials don't. U.S. are not necessarily that familiar with stuff. The civil servants in China are that's how they can build like the high-speed rail. They can do all this kind of infrastructure thing because they have good people working for them. But you never get to see that. Like, like the whole building the high-speed rail network. If they had any brains about their PR, they would allow you into like the headquarters of the railway ministry to see their maps and plans. It'd be like a great visual thing for television. But they're just too paranoid.
Yeah. Yes. Did you have any preconception before you went to China? That's something that perhaps you change your mind about later.
I guess I changed my mind over time about the importance of public intellectuals in China. Like, I think initially in the 90s when I was there, I was like, I don't want to talk to these guys. It's like a waste of time. Yeah. And one of the best, interviews that I did, though, in hindsight, was with Wang Xiaobo, the
writer.
Yeah, writer, novelist. And I had like one of the last interviews with him, a long interview, and I went with a professional photographer, Mark Leong, and Mark did portraits of Wang. There are no really good portraits except for him, of these by Mark that he did, because back, people didn't have phones, stuff like that. They didn't take a lot of pictures. So I really should have done more of that. But it was only when I went back to China after the Olympics, I was then writing a lot for the New York Review of Books, and Bob Silvers was like, try to let us know what's going on with intellect. I should talk to them. And so I ended up doing a Q&A series with them, which is still on the review's website. I think that probably, and this is what led to the book Spark, ultimately, because I think I began to realize that this was important. But, yeah.
Who were the intellectuals that impressed you at the time when you just started to take notice?
Well, I was interested in people like Guo Yuhua, or Ran Yunfei. Many of those people. I think the very first one I did was with Yang Jisheng, the ground counter historian or the unofficial historian of the famine and all that stuff. They were all really, really good people, really interesting people. A lot of those people in Xi'an that I talked to, Chen Hongguo, the law professor, he ran this public space called I Know Nothing, Zhu Zhi, and so,
Zhu Zhi?
Yeah. So those were impressive.
Yeah.
I wasn't a, historian of Chinese intellectual thought, or it wasn't sort of my goal. I mean, there are many people like Perry who've done great things like that. Better.
I guess we can do your childhood growing up.
Okay. Childhood. Growing up, I was born.
Oh, you were born in Montreal?
Yeah, born in Montreal, yeah.
Yeah. How was it like growing up in Montreal?
Well, that was very interesting. It was a very interesting time. It was, as I mentioned earlier, it was a time of a lot of political tension, all about language and culture. And that to me made me understand the importance of speaking to people in their own language, because in the 18th century, the British and the French fought a war. The French lost, and the colony of Quebec went to Britain, and that's why Canada has French and English as these two major cultures. And I was part of the Anglophone minority in Quebec. So Montreal was 40% Anglophone, 60% Francophone. The whole province was 80% Francophone, 20% Anglophone. And basically that's all the people in Montreal. It was like people in Montreal, maybe a few other areas. So we were from that generation. I was from the generation where we had French immersion class. So in the early 70s, as I mentioned, there was a terrorist movement. There was letterbox bombings. A minister was killed by this group called the FLQ, the Federation for the Liberation of Quebec. And so I remember going, to school, and they had like these things like don't touch letterboxes and stuff like that. And this is all because of language and culture, and not treating people with the proper respect. Really, some of the Anglophones still treated the French like, inferior subjects. And some of my relatives, many Anglophones, began to leave Quebec. There was a thing called the Quiet Revolution when Francophones began to move up in industry and so on and so forth. And many Anglophones began to leave. Like my mother's side of the family, all of her sister and they all left to go to Toronto. And my parents stayed on. We lived in a mixed neighborhood of Francophone, Anglophone, and our next door neighbor was this guy, André Dalman, you can Google him. He's a well-known theorist of French separatism. When he died in the early 90s, he was a really unhealthy guy, like a massive chain smoker and all. He sort of died quite young, like 55 or 60. It was a huge funeral. It was like a state funeral, and the former governor of Quebec went to attend this. He was our next door neighbor. I can remember the federal government passed this kind of like emergency decree. They called it the War Powers Act. And Mr. Dalman came to my father and says, I'm going up to a hunting lodge in the north of Quebec to hide out for a little while. Can you look after my home? And I guess we experienced a lot of that stuff firsthand. And I think that had an impact on me as well. So we experienced that kind of political turmoil firsthand. And I think it really contributed to my feeling that you have to learn the language. Like I never wanted to be one of those reporters that worked with a translator. Yeah. Some people make a whole career out of writing about places, books and stuff like that, about places where they can't communicate with people directly. They have to always work with translators. I couldn't imagine doing that. Like I just feel like you lose the nuance. It's also terribly inefficient because if you're going through a translator all the time, it's like, you have an hour conversation, but really you only have half an hour because half of it's this translation.
Yes, and then the translator only ever translate like 80% of the material or like 60% of the material.
And also, because also journalists don't hire professional translators. They hire like news assistants whose job is to also pay the bills in the office and to do filing and help you run down stuff. They're not professional translators. So somebody will give you this really amazing idiomatic expression, and the translation will be like, "Oh, he was happy." It's like, if you've ever seen a movie with Bill Murray, Lost in Translation, where the Japanese director is giving him these long instructions, and then Bill Murray's like looks at the translator and she's like, more emotion. And Bill Murray's like, but he just talked to me for 5 minutes. What if he say? He's just more emotion. And that's kind of what, you can see these things. I mean, it's not to say you can't, there are many good journalists. You can't know every language in the world, but I think we should have more professionalization in a way. And I think it would be better. Like that model, I think it's pretty much dying out anyway. The model of the big expat correspondent who would go from London to Paris to Moscow to Beijing to Tokyo and then retire or something like that. That's kind of dying out. One thing was like really expensive and newspapers don't have money for that. But it was also led to this kind of neo-imperialist view. Like, here I am, arrived in Beijing. Oh, where's the silk market so I can go buy some funny toys to take home to my family? Or where can I, where is this and that? And, they don't have any interaction with Chinese people. When I was there in the 90s, there were still a lot of people like that. They were basically only spent their weekends with other expats, stuff like that. They weren't bad journalists. I mean, they were professionals, but they were not really hanging out with Chinese people.
No. Do you think you actually, now that I hear your story of how Canada was in the middle of a turmoil, often violence, and to do with religion, to do with language, with culture, and much later in your life, you did work on Islamic fundamentalism in Europe and tracing the cultural and economic and political origins of that story. I just wonder if your earlier life experience resonated with that sort of story of conflicts, violence amidst cultural differences. And that became something of a founding basis for all your journalism later.
It had some, for sure, it's had some impact. Yes, definitely. That book on the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe was a bit of an outlier because it's the only, of the 4 books I've written, it's the only one that isn't about China. It was at a time when it was right after 9/11. It was a direct result of 9/11 because I was in Germany. I was the bureau chief, and there were 4 pilots that crashed airplanes on 9/11. 3 of the 4 pilots were radicalized in Germany. They had lived in Germany. They'd gone to Germany as young students who were not radicals, and they became radicalized in Germany. And so that set us off on this quest of why did they get radicalized in Germany? You'd think they would get radicalized in the Middle East or something, right? But they were actually radicalized in Europe. What was going on? And that's what was sort of answering that question. That sent me into archives, and I got a lot of interesting stuff. And I think the main thing was just that this is also why in The Souls of China, I don't have stuff on minority religion, right? I don't have anything on Tibet or Xinjiang because I felt that, it would be too much. Like these are kind of really separate cultures. And if I'm going to delve into all of that, the book was already long enough. It would get even longer. It's not meant to be an encyclopedia. And it was enough to do the 1.3 billion Han Chinese people without the 100 million minorities. But another key reason is I don't speak Tibetan or Uyghur. And so I felt like it would be hard I didn't want to have to work through translators and stuff like that. So.
And Falun Gong?
The Falun Gong thing, I think though, maybe what I brought that was different is I've always been interested in religion. And when I was in the 1990s, I thought I was going to write a book on Taoism in China because I was really interested in Dao Jiao.
You're going to all these underground Taoist temples back in the first trip to China.
Yeah, and I thought Taoism is the only indigenous religion in China, and I thought it would be really cool. I had these mistaken ideas about Taoism, but I thought of it like the Rosetta Stone for Chinese culture because all of these things like the Wuxing, the 5 elements, and the Taiji, the Yin Yang, all this sort of comes from Taoism, but that actually is not exactly accurate. And what it did do is I knew a lot of religious scholars, and all through the 1990s. And one thing that I did that was a bit different from other correspondents is I couldn't always. The Association of Asian Studies would have this big conference every year. In fact, I just came from it yesterday in Seattle this past weekend. Yeah. And back then in the 1990s, I was a member of the Association of Asian Studies, and I would get a copy of the catalog, the physical catalog of all the panels sent to me in Beijing. And then I would go through it and see what people had presented on, and I would mark it. And then I'd say, aha, so there's this professor who's doing stuff on Taoism or whatever it was, or on rural taxation, right? There might be a panel on that. And then I was using email, which was relatively new at the time, and emailing back to these people. I had a membership directory. And so I could email back to them, can I have a copy of your paper? And stuff like that. So they would send me their paper, and then I would interview them on the phone. And so I kind of had a lot of knowledge of the cutting edge academic work being done on this. So when Falun Gong came along, a lot of people frankly bought the government description of it as a cult. And I thought, I just knew from religious studies that cult itself is just a derogatory term. It doesn't mean anything. You can't define a cult in any meaningful way. And the government was just using this as a way to attack Falun Gong. When you look at Falun Gong, it's a very typical folk religion in China that takes elements of Buddhism and Taoism and then other stuff and mixes it all together into this mishmash. And that's what Falun Gong really is. And so I was talking to people like David Ownby, who now is better known for his translation work, but back then was a scholar of Chinese cults. And he wrote a book on Falun Gong also, on Chinese cult,民间信仰, folk belief, folk religion, and Baron Terhar, that professor who was at Oxford, or at Leiden at the time. And so I think that really informed my understanding of Falun Gong. So I was probably, in some ways, being more sympathetic to Falun Gong, because I thought, no matter how nutty they are, they're not that unusual in Chinese history, and they certainly don't deserve to be attacked by the police. And so I was very interested in writing about that when it started to happen. Initially, I was at the Wall Street Journal, and initially there was a guy, Craig Smith, who was writing. He'd actually interviewed Li Hongzhi in New Jersey, and he left to go to the New York Times, and so I took over that story in late 1999.